Okay, and officially we are recording. Hello, everybody. Today is November 6, 2019. We are doing our SIG API Machinery bi-weekly meeting. We don't have a super long agenda in items, but probably this item could help with some discussion around. So let's start with
exciting. But first, congrats to Fede, who is now co-chair of API Machinery.
Urged.
Thank you.
Yeah, David and I are still TL as co-TL as we discussed, and David and Fede are co-chairs. So
I'm honored to help this SIG organize and move forward.
This issue came up when we were trying to figure out what to do for the scale sub-resource for apply. Like how are we supposed to go through and assign owners? And we realized that actually the webhook chain kind of has the same problem, and it's basically unsolved and maybe unthought through, although I know that some great thinking has happened in this issue, or at least I saw a bunch of comments which I haven't read. So the basic idea of the problem is when a request comes into a webhook, or when a request comes into API server, you can register webhooks for either the parent resource or a sub-resource. And the promise that we thought we offered to webhooks was that like every change to the resource would go through your webhook, but that's not actually what happens. What happens is if a change goes to like the scale sub-resource, webhooks that register for the scale sub-resource get the scale object and see the change, but webhooks who have registered for the parent resource do not see the change. So, for example, if you wrote a webhook for that hook deployments and you expect to take action whenever the spec.replicas field changes, and somebody goes in, somebody like the horizontal pod autoscaler goes in and makes a call to the scale sub-resource, your webhook will not see that change. That's the basic problem. And last I saw on this issue, which I was super busy and didn't get a chance to read to the end because I think some comments have been made, we didn't have a good solution for it.
Is this true uniformly of sub-resources? Like if you make a call to the status sub-resource, does that mean like a validating webhook?
Yes, it is. It is true of all resources, but scale is, or a status is a little bit unique because we enforce an API server that if you call to status, you cannot change spec, and likewise, if you call to spec, you cannot change status. You can change metadata in both places. So if your webhook expected that, then yes, it has.
It depends on which path you take. As I recall, in CRDs, we do not allow changing metadata because it was more bug than feature.
It might be a bug that people rely on. So we may have to, like if we solve it for built-in resources, we may as well use the same solution for CRDs and vice versa, but it's harder to take things away.
My point was kind of going along the lines of people may be expecting their validating webhook as a substitute for more complex validation to also apply to status to make sure that like status updates are well formed.
Yeah, I think that's a restatement of the problem.
Yeah.
Well, you really need to be able to separate those two things out, right? Like if you look at the way we validate spec and status for the resources we create, we are very careful to separate out, are you updating spec or are you updating status, so that a change to status with a spec that is already invalid can still be accepted. And we do that so that if something goes wrong, controllers are still able to report the state of the world.
I can see how that might address the like spec and status or the status sub-resource problem, but I don't think it addresses the like scale sub-resource problem and that class of things.
Yeah, the scale one is more compelling because it is a sub-resource that is affecting the primary resource, and intercepting scale and admission wouldn't give you all the information about the object.
Yeah, that's the thing that makes it a user problem and not just a theoretical problem, is like even if you write a webhook that also that hooks the scale sub resource, you don't see the rest of the object, so you don't know what that scale change is affecting.
Okay, that makes a difference.
Yeah, if it was just spec and status, I would say register for both spec and status.
Yeah. If you keep scrolling down here, I don't know who is this, you, Fede? Yeah, if you keep scrolling down a little bit, Jordan. Jordan asked some really hard questions there. What user, like now we have a big problem because we're not directly echoing the request. Like, for example, if I'm authorized to send changes to the status, or sorry, the scale sub-resource, that does not at all imply that I'm authorized to make other changes to the parent resource. So, and we tell webhooks the user that is making the change. So is it okay to send a request through the parent resource's webhooks listing a user which is not actually authorized to make a change to that parent resource?
Doesn't the admission what's it called, the thing we send to the webhook, we record what path the user has, right? So if we just send the path and the original user, the webhook can't tell if it's.
So we send the path.
Do we?
Also, if we do that, that makes a different question, which is, are webhooks going to be prepared to see a path there that they did not actually register for?
We don't send the path for resource requests, I don't think. We do indicate what resource the request was made to, and so resource and sub-resource.
Yeah, maybe we can use that, but that doesn't directly tell you.
Well, I think the following question is, even if we work out how to deal with that, if the webhook mutates a field beyond the user's permissions, what should we do?
Yeah, that question's coming, yeah.
Not just the user's permissions, but a field other than replicas at all.
Right. Yeah. The general case is, like, I expect as somebody that if I change the replicas field by calling the scale sub resource, that I shouldn't be able to change other aspects of the object. But you can easily write for example, a validating webhook that thinks that a reasonable policy is that the spec dot replicas field always matches some random annotation, or maybe a environment variable that's going to be passed into the container image, right? Which, like,
a validating one wouldn't be terrible. A mutating one that tried to
well, the validating one would like
that.
never be able to get something past the validating one, right? Right. If somebody thinks they're enforcing a system invariant and actually they aren't, like maybe their expectations is wrong, but something is wrong.
Yeah, I was gonna say those are just two different sides of the same problem.
Yeah.
The mutating webhook that updated that environment variable, is that strictly wrong? Right, like the operation the scale sub resource provides is increase or decrease the replicas count for existing objects. That has been literally the replicas field, but it seems to me like there's hypothetically nothing preventing that from theoretically being an environment variable, or the representation of replicas in the concrete object being an environment variable or something.
I think for CRDs, you can already map that. You can enable the sub-resource and map that field to any field in the CRD, which is fine and not problematic. The problematic part comes in when the mutating webhook echoes that somewhere else in the object, and now it's changing a field that we don't necessarily expect the scale sub-resource to change, but maybe it's okay, and that's sort of the question. Like, is it actually okay?
I mean, I think there's another approach, right? I think if you think that should get reflected, maybe that's something that should be done by a controller as opposed to a webhook.
But you lose atomicity, right? So there's some benefit to being able to say, given an update, I can automatically make this change.
If you want that atomicity and you want all of those things to change, then maybe you shouldn't be trying to use that sub-resource. You should be trying to modify.
Yeah, that's not a solution though, because system components.
Things like HPA and there's a lot of things like the scale polymorphic sub-resource is important to support.
I mean, yeah, I think my argument is
like
that
I replicate the replicas field to somewhere else in the object. Is that actually a compelling use case, or would we just tell someone don't do that? Like,
I don't think it is a good design. I wouldn't recommend that people store the same information in two different places in an object. It's really hard to make that work right.
Well, I mean, if you make it a restatement, right? So if it's not a direct modification, if you have something where you say the memory requirements of my system are dependent on how many other copies of it I need to talk to.
Yeah, right. But
then
if it's echoing it somewhere, that is maybe okay. Like I can sort of like setting memory requirements based on number of replicas. Maybe I can see that. Like you probably quadratically scale and shouldn't do that, but I can understand somebody actually doing it. The part where it becomes kind of impossible is if you want to go both directions. Like if a client sets replicas, do this other thing. If the client changes the other thing, then also set replicas. Like then you don't know what the source of truth is, and that's really hard to get right. We've struggled with that over conversion functions in Kubernetes API for like 5 years. Can you scroll down a little bit more? That's the last comment. Okay.
So the validation one doesn't seem like it has nearly as many problems. I think the only issue there would be what user we pass in. And if the validation webhook was doing some user-specific authorization checks or quota checks or something checks, the mutating one I think has way more problems. Is it worthwhile to? Is the mutating one the one we really care about because this came up via like server-side apply where we care about mutation stuff, or would it be worthwhile to just look at the validation case first?
I think there's definitely some value in it, since if it's less objectionable to call the validating webhook, it does seem like there's some value in like at least letting people enforce their system invariance, even if that means that all calls to the scale sub-resource will fail. That does seem somewhat valuable.
How are you gonna? So I'm okay with that, but I'd like. Is this going to be an optional behavior that happens, right? Like, so I'm thinking if I have one and for whatever reason I don't properly diff old and new, calling me from a different place can result in weird behavior, right? Like
especially if it's a validation one that's paired with a mutating one, and the validating one is the backstop. That's bad.
Well, also, how well is this going to get surfaced? I mean, if I break autoscaler by putting in a validating, is that just going to be a hidden error because the only thing that ever saw the error message of why the sub-resource request failed is some system resource that...
Yeah,
I mean, that already exists today. So you can break HPA by hooking the scale sub-resource, and I think it reports errors, but if it doesn't, it should. You can already break that today.
Also, your thing would not scale, so.
I'm not denying we can break it. I'm just saying, are we going to be making our own lives worse in, more hidden reasons why the system stops working?
I don't think it's hidden. I know HPA does report some errors today. I'm not sure about the scale update errors.
I think that error is very obvious if your system is not scaling. It may not be obvious why it's not scaling, but it's definitely obvious that it's not scaling.
No, well, that's my point, right? Is we just get something that says HPA is not scaling, and then it becomes. I mean, it would be nice if we were at least had a plan for how that gets surfaced, so that it's easy and fast.
I think we like the general problem of it's kind of difficult to tell. When a webhook is blocking a request, it's kind of difficult to tell which webhook it was and why the webhook blocked it, and that's a more general problem. that we don't necessarily have to solve at the same time, although if we make it drastically worse, maybe we should consider that.
No,
But we should
argument.
solve that. We should solve that anyway, like regardless of what we decide about this. Like,
Yeah, the HPA controller does report on the HPA object if an error is returned when it tries to scale, and it records what the error was.
Okay.
That's pretty convenient. So assuming we can figure out, it seems like if we want to call mutating webhooks, we either have to agree that it is okay for the mutating webhook to change a field other than the field included in the subresource, or we have to filter the output of the webhook and prevent it from doing so, in which case, why would we bother running the field or the webhook at all? Yeah. So maybe that doesn't make sense as an option.
Some people use mutating webhooks to block requests. So you could have a mutating webhook that would say, I'm going to maybe make some modification or check if it's not acceptable to make that modification, then I'll block the request. So
why wouldn't you
use mutating ones as a policy hook?
Why wouldn't you do that in a validating webhook?
Because I can do it in a mutating webhook, and why would I want to write two webhooks? I'm not saying it's
no, but I think that's
recommended or best, but people are expecting it to run. So,
but that's actually provably wrong, right, Jordan? Because you don't know if there's another mutating webhook after you, and so you don't even know that you're blocking correctly.
That's true, but I do know that I'm blocking the user from doing a thing.
Yeah. If you're trying to,
so if the cluster admin put another privileged webhook into the system that expresses some conflicting opinion with mine, like I might not get the invariant I expected, but I do know that the cluster admin made the decision to put in another webhook that did something different.
You may not be blocking the exact thing that you think you're blocking, but at least you're blocking the call completely. So. Okay.
I agree. Like we do say, if you want to do this for policy and you want to make sure that you're doing what you think you're doing, you should use a validating webhook. We do say that, but
I mean, my point is that you aren't actually blocking, right? Because the change that you're trying to block may have occurred after your mutating webhook, and so you actually failed to catch the invariant you wanted.
Right. If your invariant is unprivileged user or low privileged users cannot do a thing, then you can accomplish that with a mutating webhook.
Unless the thing that the change is one that came from a webhook that called after.
Walter, the example change is like you want to prevent any change to the object. It doesn't matter what it is. You want to block any change, then you can do that with a mutating webhook.
And if you observed your webhook was called and then it rejected it and then somehow it got into the system, that would be cause to consider it a bug, probably.
Yeah, that wouldn't, yeah. How do people feel about permitting mutating webhooks to change fields other than the ones referenced in the subresource?
It's weird.
I'm not a fan.
How about the validation?
How weird is it on a scale from like, I don't know, 1 to 10? 10 is like 10 is
I think it's
so it's weird enough that I would consider trying to make the call me for sub-resources something optional that you can decide, you know what, I really want to be called anytime the spec or metadata of this object changes. And I will manage my expectations based on the sub-resource because I just looked and that gets passed in.
Would you? Oh, so here's an interesting question.
It's sort of like the option where we let people allow conversions from other API kind and versions. This is like the same thing, just we also allow the conversion from the sub-resource.
Yeah.
Can you even represent, you might even be able to represent that in the existing field.
Yeah, you could say the request came to the scale sub-resource and the user provided a auto-scaling v1 scale object, and I am calling you the webhook with a deployment object at the deployments resource. Like,
yeah.
We can represent that.
In which case, that
Wacky.
doesn't seem that weird. As an API, like you have to opt into it.
I don't remember exactly how that's expressed in the configuration object.
I think it's a list of like GVKs that you can understand, that your webhook will understand.
The configuration object, it's not a list. It's just call me for any resource that is backed by the same storage. So I'm going to register for V1 deployments. If you talk to any version of deployments, convert it to a V1 deployment and call me.
How do you say any version? Is it
the match policy? It says match exactly what I registered for or
right.
equivalent resources.
Okay. So we could. The problem with that is that people who have marked that they want equivalent resources may not expect a scale to be an equivalent resource.
Yeah.
Arguably they should, but they may not.
I mean, I'm going to say that if I were authoring one of these, I don't think I would.
If you had authored one of these and it started getting scale resources, do you think it would, well, we wouldn't be giving it scale resources.
We wouldn't give it scale.
We'd be giving it deployments.
I would be.
This
all
seems
right,
like
so let's see if we turn it on. Would we be able to make it opt out?
Straw proposal, suppose that we made it like this behavior, if we hid it behind a feature gate.
I don't think a cluster admin is going to be able to uniformly decide that all the admission webhooks they have deployed in their cluster are ready to accept this.
Yeah, that means we would have to.
And they might not even be authoring those webhooks. They might be authored by somebody else.
Yeah.
Is there a concrete example of where you would be surprised, like a webhook that you think would be surprised to receive a deployment change that was triggered by a scale subresource? I'm kind of surprised at that opinion. And
anything that ran an authorization type check against the user.
So, for example, we had an OpenShift cluster resource overrides and a couple others. We've eliminated a few of them, but it checked the user to decide whether you had permissions to uniformly do something or unilaterally do something regardless of other policy. And if you did, it let it through. And if you didn't, it would run a secondary check to make sure that your user had been granted the permission to take the action. And it was applied to things like deployments, stateful sets, and replica sets.
Yes, this definitely would have broken that. Even, was that in a validating webhook?
Oh, geez. At the time we wrote it, there wasn't even a distinction, but I converted to validating, and then eventually I decided that one was crazy and I removed it. But but I'm saying that, like, yeah, these things concretely, like people,
like
sane people would have
policy type admission, like anything where people are plugging in a policy engine and saying, like, is the user allowed to do a thing based on some attribute of the object?
Yeah, I don't have a specific example in mind. It's just in my mental model that people do basically anything that is imaginable.
But let's say we made it a bit on the actual registration. That is, like, I want to be notified of if we think scale is special, scale.
If I was a webhook author, I would want to see a field when I register, because that's a hint to me that there's some functionality I hadn't thought about. So when I was reading how to register an admission webhook, then I would see, oh, there's something about scale here. What is this? How does it work?
Okay.
And then as we ratchet up, maybe we could say someday we get a V2 API and it's no longer optional or configurable.
Why can't we just have an included sub-resources field? And then you can.
I think that's basically what Joe just proposed. Yeah. So I don't know if we'd call it literally that, but yeah, include versus or alternative represent. Yeah, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like we've kind of converged on, and I found Joe's point convincing. It sounds like we kind of converged on add a field to the API. If the field is set, then we need to call the parent sub-resource or that webhook, even if the scale, even if it's a sub-resource.
Yeah, if they opt in, then plumbing the actual user that made the actual call to that webhook is
Yeah.
sensible.
Yeah.
And we already have the fields to indicate that the user requested this thing over here, but you're actually being notified for this resource over here. So that hangs together as long as they're expecting it.
So
If the chance of having to adjust the admission webhook stack, then I think that will force the code to be refactored in a way that makes apply easier.
So, okay, so let's say we do this. Would we apply it uniformly for all sub-resources?
Not all sub-resources affect a change on the parent resource.
So the rule would be if you make a change to the parent sub-resource, we would call you.
Yes, I think that would have to be the rule. This wouldn't affect like the, I don't know, the exec sub-resource on pods.
Yeah, we have additional ones in OpenShift, right? Like multiple sub-resources
Log,
on
proxy, like, yeah, all the weird ones.
Yeah, basically, if you're not going through the like backend half, that's like the storage stack, then we don't have to call. We don't have to worry about this. I think that is the rule.
Okay.
Yeah, we have two kinds of sub-resources, right? Some which are just like share the lifecycle of their parent but are their own thing, and then some which are kind of like a view into the main resource.
Oh yeah, that's true. Like, do we actually have any that are actually completely distinct?
I don't know if they exist yet.
What does pods binding do? I think
It writes to the node name field.
name. And then we had a real resource called binding or bind.
Yeah, that was a
Proxy.
misnomer. I believe we've gotten rid of that one. I hope. Okay.
Is the last unresolved question whether or not a mutating webhook would be allowed to change fields outside the contract for the
Did we already establish who the user was going to be?
I think it should be the user who is making the call.
Yeah, if you're opting in, if the webhook is opting in, then I think they should be prepared for that. We can document it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You had something to say.
So I'm thinking, so there's still the ordering issue.
Yeah, we haven't gotten to the ordering question. Yeah.
Well, and we are going to have the path of the request. So you know which sub-resource it was.
We say the original kind the source kind, so that should be clear enough.
So if you want to act on one sub-resource and not on another, you can just place that in
Yeah, the admission object that's sent has the request group version kind and group version resource.
I think you should such a thing if you want to. Okay, have we agreed on everything except for the ordering?
Whether the webhook, a mutating webhook, can change fields outside of the...
Right. I think if you're going to opt in...
I don't think you should be able to.
I agree.
Able to, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And so finally, the ordering. I think the only thing that is clear to me about the ordering is that all the mutating ones have to be called before all of the validating ones.
Yeah.
Right. Like it wouldn't make sense to let us to like mutating, validating, because then some invariants might be skipped.
Well, hang on. For scale, it seems like you would want to get the scale completely done, validated, and then apply it to the core resource, and then get that result mutated and validated. I don't see
because if the core resource mutating webhook changes the spec.replica's value in a way that the scale sub-resource webhook doesn't like, then you've skipped that. You've made that. Now, of course, it shouldn't do that because that is changing the user's intent, but it could. We don't prevent it.
Hang on, I'm trying to parse what my expectations are. So are you thinking that after you have mutated the base resource, you would then call a scale validating webhook with the core resource? Like, how would it even know that it changed?
You convert the core resource into the scale kind.
So a sub-resource that does this kind of view onto the parent resource already has to be able to convert back and forth between them.
Yeah.
So if you look at all the scale resource, sub-resource implementations, we have a deployment to scale and scale to deployment.
In fact, if you look at the code, it's like even dumber than that. It just copies that one field between the two.
Yeah. So basically, you have things that want to mutate or validate the sub-resource, and things that want to mutate or validate the parent resource. And so in the simplest case, a mutating one on the sub-resource would like set scale to 2, and a validator would make sure that scale was 2. And if you run both of those and they both pass, and then you start calling mutators and validators on the parent one, a mutator there could say, oh, no, replicate should definitely be 3. And a validator there would say, sure, 3 looks good to me. And so then your sub-resource validator has its invariant violated.
So what happens, that seems unexpected with regards to the way the root resource works, right? Like if I submit an update directly to the root resource, I can violate an invariant that is placed on the scale sub-resource. But
you're saying not only do we need to call the root resource when you change scale, we also need to call the scale sub-resource webhooks when we change the root resource.
That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying if you're making the argument, if you're making the argument you just made, then I think that the logical conclusion is that you have to make the argument that Daniel just made, which
so scale might be a bad example because it is. It lets you change a field that can also be changed via the main resource. If we're wanting to make this generic and say you can register a webhook for the top level resource and say also send me things for sub resources when they mess with my fields, then you could register one for the top level object and say also send me status things. And so that's a more compelling example where the thing that registered specifically for status monkeyed with status in its mutating hook and then asserted an invariant in its validating hook. And that actually today is protecting. Like you can't change stuff under status except by going through that endpoint. And so there, the order where you call the one registered specifically for the sub-resource and the one registered specifically for the parent resource matters.
And there's different permissions that you can set for users on both, right? So you might intentionally only put some things on the sub-resource.
Yeah, making this opt-in, I think, lets us hand wave the permissions thing away. Like if you opt in to getting called for this, you better be making and you're doing permission checks, you better be making distinctions.
Yeah. So how would the opt-in work if I've registered for the scale sub-resource or for the sub-resource rather than the root resource? If I opt in, does that mean I should view changes to the root resource? Or should we make it a one-way? Like we can solve this concern by making the API.
I would make the API be like also sub-resources foobar baz. Like
Okay, so that makes it clear that if you register for a sub-resource, you don't get the root resources change. You don't get to screen the root resources changes, which means that if people want to maintain a invariant over the resource, they need to write that as a validating webhook on the parent resource and not on the sub-resource. I think I'm okay with that. It seems a little crazy to like call every sub-resource's webhooks every time the main resource gets changed. That seems a little excessive. That was kind of my point.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're good, and we just need somebody to write this.
So what was the ordering that we make the decision on?
Ordering. So I
Sorry.
expect to go from most specific to most general.
But I think mutating should
mutating first
before all validating.
Yeah, so mutating sub, mutating on main, validating on sub, validating on main.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah, the validating actually all the webhooks can be called in parallel.
Oh,
Yeah.
right.
For all of them, so that doesn't need to be ordered. But the mutating
Does.
Yeah, so that's right. Mutating on sub-resource, mutating on main resource, all the validating in parallel.
So throw one small wrench into that. We have this concept of optionally running through twice.
Yes.
So does that mean general mutate, specific mutate, general mutate, specific mutate
yeah.
on running through twice?
I think it means specific, general, specific, general.
Okay.
The complete order twice. Yeah.
Twice.
It doesn't
Okay.
mean specific, specific, general, general.
Yeah. Okay.
As long as we build the chain, that should
Yeah, I just
that should be implemented.
it is
Yeah.
part of the ordering, so I wanted to make sure we had specified.
That's important.
Yes. Okay. Who wants to volunteer to write this down and forever live as the author of this?
We should take like 2 minutes and just write down where we arrived before we forget, like in the next 30 seconds. 2 minutes. And then we can expand it in the.
Maybe I'll
Do it in the issue or in the notes?
We can do it in the discussion docs.
Find you.
Jordan started in the meeting notes.
Okay. Oh, Jordan's already started.
Thank you, Jordan.
I'll validate it in parallel.
Maybe I can write a.
And then enabled on.
Are we expecting them to list all of the resources, all the sub-resources, or would we allow them to specify star? Or
It should probably be a
I
list
think
of strings where star is one of the options. Like that's
I
how
like allowing star because if a fancy new
field comes in.
sub-resource shows up,
I agree.
I can still enforce my invariance.
I have a question. So if I don't use this new opt-in field, I just register my webhook and say I want to intercept calls to all the replica sets and the replica set /star. What's the difference from this configuration to if I use this opt-in new field and I only say I intercept replica sets?
So if you use the opt-in new field, you see the user's request expressed in the form of a replica set. If you register for the sub-resource, you see the user's request expressed in the form of a scale or whatever that sub-resource is.
So if they change the replica count, you actually see what it looks like in context. So if you are trying to enforce invariance relative to other replica set fields, you have that information.
Okay.
And very importantly, you can basically ensure that you are going to, in one place, capture all changes to that object, even if there was some future sub-resource.
That star is no longer a question mark, right?
Yeah.
We finish each other's sandwiches.
Yeah, you can probably word that better.
May not change fields. The sub-resource doesn't include.
I thought we said that they may.
I thought we said that we may not.
It's good that we have
It's down.
so just like a request to the status sub-resource, a mutating webhook can change fields under spec all at once, but those changes are discarded. They're not effective.
But changes to so different sub-resources behave different ways.
like a subresource is a lens onto a specific set of fields. And so the status subresource only lets you change things under status and some old resources metadata. The scale subresource only lets you change the replicas field.
But I agree. It has to work that way for scale because it always has, and that's an invariant. But I don't think it can work that way for status. It has to work that way. But for scale, does it have to work that way?
It would seem consistent.
If you so if you allow, if you have to round trip the changes through the object that is submitted to the subresource, because remember we have to be able to call mutating subresource admission plugins, then parent admission plugins, then subresource, then parent. If you have to round trip
I see what you're
through
saying.
the scale object, you can only do that with the replicas field.
Kind of. I mean, if you look at the way this code is written right now, it isn't actually going through a conversion pipeline. It's just copying a field back and forth, which if we did it that way would preserve any changes not in that field. If they may not change other fields, I guess yeah. So some reason, the reason to call them mutating webhooks is that some sub-resources have overlapping fields. Right. It's not super useful for scale because there's only that one field, and you wouldn't be able to use this to use the spec.replicas field to update your environment variable. We're basically saying you can't do that. Which,
yeah, it's pretty useless in this case.
Yeah, it's pretty useless in this case. It's more useful like if you're reacting to metadata changes in between like status and spec.
Yeah, like principle of least surprise is that a mutating webhook can make any change to the object that a user could make to that object via that endpoint. Like,
yeah. Okay. I honestly, I think people who want to do this are doing something slightly weird. So I'm okay with making them come back to us and presenting justification for extending this. I think it is a reasonable request, but it's not obvious to me that it is like the marginal benefit isn't necessarily commensurate with the marginal effort.
Yeah.
So
if we allowed it, we'd never roll it back, but if we don't do it, we could add it later.
I wonder if some of this is just would some of these use cases would just be a crutch over the fact that scale for CRDs is literally a direct projection at the moment and not like a semi-arbitrary projection.
Yeah. Well, for actually, do we can you change metadata on the deployment by calling the scale sub-resource? I can't recall.
I don't think so. I hope not.
I don't think so either. I think I looked at the code and it's literally just copying the one.
I think it just copies the replica.
Yeah. Field. Okay. So we should be okay. All right.
Just to understand it correctly, you're talking about the parent webhook. So if I call scale and I change it, then first the sub-resource webhook is called, and the parent is not allowed to change fields other than that of the scale resource.
The replica.
Is that what you're saying?
Resource.
Yeah. How would we?
Gonna fail, or is it gonna?
Yeah, that's the question. Does this cause?
Because the author would have to.
I mean, it's
take
pretty
care that he's not updating.
Replicas, which is going to be the same thing as reset.
Yeah. So there's two ways of enforcing it. One is like we can just take whatever they say for scale and use that, and if they use something else and it doesn't, then we ignore it. Or we can detect if they tried to change something else and fail if they did so.
So I think that's pretty easy. I'm questioning the usefulness of all of that. Is it useful to add a new opt-in configuration flag for something that doesn't seem super useful? Like, do we have anybody that is actually going to use that? a mutating.
You're saying overall the
yeah,
thing
all
that
of
we've
that. We
described
could
is
just
not
say,
useful.
let's do validation and call it a day. Is it
calling a validating webhook and not the accompanying mutating one is unexpected.
Even if you have to opt in for the validating one?
Do we need to opt in for validation?
Yes, because you might not expect like it's not like a system design correctness thing. It's you've got stuff that already works and may not expect this new class of input.
Okay, if we have to add the option, then let's do mutation. If we,
Since it's not really more work for us to fix both.
So for me, kind of some reason to call the parent webhook, mutating parent webhook gets lost if it only can do half of its job, just because it's called through scale.
Yeah.
So strawman, like what if you're recording something like last user change in annotations in the, or like last change reason in an annotation?
Yes, this is kind of why I thought we'd all agreed that yes, it was okay, but I guess everybody broke up at that instant and we missed the word not. Yeah, it doesn't seem super useful to call a mutating webhook if it basically can only change exactly the thing that the user can change. Yeah. Do we have any other compelling examples besides the scale sub-resource?
The binding one for pod.
That's also only a single field. We've got to have sub-resources that are more than just one field.
Ephemeral container.
Yeah, ephemeral container is an interesting one. That definitely affects more than one field.
Yeah, what if you want to, I don't know, I haven't used them yet, but what if you want to add can you add a volume when you add an ephemeral container?
No,
so
you
have to.
Ephemeral containers, it's segregated into a separate list from the regular containers.
Oh, okay.
We add new entries to it. Can't change the rest of the pod object. At least last I saw. All right, maybe maybe we can think about this, and when we write it down, we can.
So the alternatives are allow it or disallow it silently or disallow it with an error, right?
Yeah, those are the three choices.
Yeah.
I think so. For some of our resources, it is expressible. Like you can attempt the corresponding thing today. Like for status, you can try to set spec, and when you call the main one, you can try to set a status field. And today we transparently just drop it if you do this, to the annoyance of most of our users.
Yeah.
Do not expect that.
I have a question about that.
One second. Yeah. Let me enumerate the other case, which is the rest of our relevant sub-resources. You cannot even express this, right? Like you can't, when you send a scale sub-resource, you can't also include like a environment variable change, so you can't actually express it. So if we squint, maybe we could say that behavior is actually just undefined rather than like explicitly disallowed, and we could define a different behavior for the webhooks involved.
I find that unexpected. I like whether the gate that the data has to go through is the actual API type that's submitted, or like a method in the REST handler that says before I persist this, I'm gonna like throw away data outside the specific field.
So
that seems very well defined to me.
Let me try one other thing, which is by our conversion rule, every field needs to be round trippable so that it can survive arbitrary conversions. The sub-resources currently do not abide by this rule, right? Like deployment to scale to deployment is a super lossy transformation. which is not actually how our conversions are supposed to work. If our conversions worked correctly and it called them correctly, then we would get this behavior by default. Right, a mutating webhook in the chain would make a change that affected the result. So
I think as a cluster admin, I grant powers to these endpoints that are like windows into the resource because it lets me control how much the resource can be changed.
Is it how much or who?
Deciding the who.
The endpoint controls how much.
As a cluster admin, you're also explicitly installing a mutating webhook, presumably that does additional things, right? Like,
yeah,
you are making the decision that I'm installing this webhook that can also do additional things.
Yeah.
After scale.
Installing the additional webhook doesn't mean that I expect the core promise of the sub-resource to change.
Yeah, like if the presence of a webhook can let the scale sub-resource change fields other than replicas, that's extremely hard to reason about. Like what does the replicas or the scale sub-resource do? Like, I don't know. What kind of crazy webhooks do you have installed? Like that's not an API I'm eager to try to understand if I should grant to someone.
How about we write this down, list the options, state that we think that either discarding changes or failing the request is the least surprising thing, and ask for feedback to either confirm or disconfirm this.
What object would both hooks get? The sub-resource gets only the sub-resource, and the parent will be a whole object, or how does it work?
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of your question. How do sub-resources work?
The mutating webhook for a sub-resource, it only gets the sub-resource, and the parent one gets the full object.
Yeah. If you register for the sub-resource, you only see like the stuff in the sub-resource. Yeah.
And the parent gets the whole one.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, it's good that we wrote this down. And it looks like we're out of time. Betty, you had one other.
Well, yes, super quick. So next meeting is going to be canceled because there is KubeCon North America, and many of this group are going to be there. There is 2 official SIG API Machinery branded talks that I am aware, but maybe there is more. I will be doing introduction to SIG API Machinery on Wednesday, and Antoine, you're going to be doing the deep dive, right?
With Stefan, yeah.
Yeah, with Stefan. So come by if you are there. Hope to see many of you there in person. Say hi. And hopefully those presentations are also going to be, entry point for other people to help us come to the SIG, get involved, contribute. So yeah, that's it. Great. Thank you, everybody, for today. We had one topic and took the entire hour, so I'm glad we had it.
Good use of the hour.
Yeah, it was a complicated one. Thanks, everybody.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.